What's up, fellas? In the first video of the day, we are going to talk about Chris Paul, an interesting little rumor with Chris Paul and the Philadelphia 76ers of all teams. I know this is kind of an out-of-nowhere video, but I got the notification, I looked at the rumor, and I said, this is interesting. I want to talk about this on the channel, and that's what we're going to be doing in the first video of the day. But really quickly, before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, then consider subscribing. I upload twice a day, every single day on this channel, so it's a great place for the most consistent NBA content on YouTube. You can also leave a like rating on the videos as well if you're enjoying them, and you can check me out at various socials in a Linktree link down in the description below. If you're new here, by the way, what's up? My name is Tucker. With all those things said, let's talk about Chris Paul and the Sixers. So, as we all know, we talked about Chris Paul the other day, kind of a Chris Paul appreciation video, right? And he ends up going from Oklahoma City to Phoenix. It's really legitimized the Suns. They've done a really great job of turning around their franchise, essentially. I mean, going from one of the worst franchises in the league over the last handful of years to going 8-0 in the bubble, bring in Chris Paul, and now they're in contention for the best record in the entire league, okay? I won't go too much into the Chris Paul stuff there because we already talked about it in that video the other day. And of course, the price for Chris Paul this offseason really was not all that much, just given his contract and things like that. It's not like the Suns gave up a ton. They did give up some future stuff, but it wasn't a huge deal. But of course, there were other teams involved in trying to trade for Chris Paul this past offseason. And according to this rumor, there's two things to take away here. One, Oklahoma City was willing to work with Chris Paul in terms of where he wanted to end up because they appreciated the professionalism and the value that he provided to the franchise in what was a very tough situation for him to go from a competing team in Houston to a team in Oklahoma City that pretty much everybody knew wasn't really trying to do all that much last season. And he did some really awesome things for them. So they were prioritizing, not, overly prioritizing, but they were thinking kind of about what Chris Paul wanted in these trades, right? And a team that came up when they were looking to shop Chris Paul was Philadelphia. There were extensive talks between them and the Thunder, and of course, those two teams ultimately did decide to come to a deal in the Al Horford-Danny Green deal. So there were talks there, but initially Chris Paul was a part of them. Now, the interesting thing here for Philly is Chris Paul obviously would have been an awesome fit. They've been in rumors for a lot of different perimeter guys to kind of run the offense, whether that be Kyle Lowry or others, really over the last few years, but of course most recently this season as they have, I believe, as of the recording of this video, they're tied for, or very close to tied for, the best record in the Eastern Conference, right? And Chris Paul in Philadelphia, assuming he could have gotten along with everybody, would have been really, really interesting, right? Kind of orchestrating everything, getting everybody in the right spot. Him and Embiid, that combination, the pick and roll would have been incredible. Obviously, the shooting and the spacing and the stuff that Chris Paul provides as well. I would have really loved to see that personally. Of course, Chris Paul is doing great things in Phoenix, but I would have really liked to see what it would have looked like with this current roster, because given what Phoenix gave up for Chris Paul, they probably wouldn't have had to give up a ton there in Philly in order to get him. The Al Horford thing probably would have been involved, so they probably would have had to give up more in exchange than like Phoenix did, because it's kind of a negative asset with Al Horford trying to make the contracts work there. So, a couple of firsts and maybe a young guy or something. But in terms of how their roster looks right now, it wouldn't be all that different, with the exception of someone like Tyrese Maxey probably not being there. But when Chris Paul's in the roster, I'm not sure that really matters, right? So in terms of this year, maybe the long-term outlook would be different. But in terms of this year, they'd have a pretty similar roster, and it's a roster that, as I said, is in contention for the best record in the East this year. And given how much of a turnaround it's been for Phoenix having Chris Paul there, given how good the Sixers already were before Chris Paul would have gotten there, obviously they would have been really, really good. Now, here's the interesting part. Chris Paul did not want to go to Philadelphia, okay? It seemed like, kind of reading between the lines here, it seemed like if Chris Paul wanted to be a Sixer, they would have been pretty aggressive in going to get him. Daryl Morey obviously has experience with Chris Paul, traded for him initially. They almost and arguably should have made the finals, that one year with Chris Paul and James Harden together. And the decision to trade Paul away in exchange for Russell Westbrook, it's been pretty widely reported that was not something that Daryl Morey really wanted to do. That was really an ownership thing. It was a James Harden thing. And if things were completely left up to Daryl Morey, he probably wouldn't have traded Chris Paul, at least not in exchange for Russell Westbrook. And so any issues there potentially between Paul and Morey probably don't really exist. At least that's kind of how I'm reading into it. However, that's not to say there wouldn't have been issues with Paul in Philadelphia, most specifically with Doc Rivers. Doc Rivers has an interesting relationship with a handful of really, how should I put this, opinionated point guards that he's had throughout his coaching career. The two that come to mind most specifically being Rajon Rondo and Chris Paul. And by the time the Clippers thing really ended, in terms of, like Blake and Doc and Chris Paul. Those guys were not big fans of each other. I don't want to say they hate each other. They were not big fans of each other. And apparently some of those issues do still exist to the point where Chris Paul just was not really all that excited about going to Philadelphia, and in contrast would have rather gone to Phoenix, which is really interesting to me. You know what I mean? That's kind of a big leap, even if, there are issues there with Doc, and even if it's not Philly. It's just really interesting to me that there was a scenario in which Chris Paul kind of looked at his options, right? He's 36, however you, 35, 36 years old. And he's looking at his options. And he's thinking, I've got like 1, 2, maybe if I can push it 3 really good years left of basketball, and I want to go and try and win a title, where's my best chance to do that? You would think would be his mindset, right? Where can I go that's a really good fit for me? And he chose Phoenix over Philly. Now, granted, Monty Williams is there. There's a connection. He can see himself playing alongside Devin Booker. He knows that there is a significant future there in Phoenix. They've got the big and DeAndre Ayton. They've got the scoring guard in Devin Booker. They've got all these wings. Maybe Chris Paul just saw something that, not that a lot of people didn't see in Phoenix, but I'm not sure that we saw it to the extent of what they've been this season. Maybe we should give Chris Paul credit for seeing that, but it's just odd. You know what I mean? Like, take yourself back to last offseason, put yourself in Chris Paul's shoes, and imagine saying, I don't want to go to Philly when I'm trying to win a title. I would rather go to Phoenix, right? A Phoenix roster that up until that run of the bubble really has not been a very good franchise at all over the last 6 or 7 years, right? And even further back than that, but that was like the last time that they won 40 plus games, right? And I think, you can kind of read between the lines here and chalk some of that stuff up to maybe a weird relationship with Doc, or potentially with Daryl Morey, or you never know, kind of the interpersonal relationships of all these different players. Maybe Chris Paul isn't a big Embiid guy or a big Ben Simmons guy, whatever the case may be. But ultimately, it's just interesting that these kinds of things come out when they do. And just because I had no idea. I had no idea that Philly was potentially in on a Chris Paul trade. That was complete news to me when I got this notification yesterday or the day before. And part of me is kind of sad because I think it would have been cool for Chris Paul to be there in Philadelphia, again, because they would have kept Ben Simmons, they would have kept Embiid. I'm not sure how that would have affected the James Harden stuff, because obviously they're not going to end up trading for James Harden if they got Chris Paul. Those two guys are not on the same page there. So it would have been interesting to see how that affected potentially what the Nets ended up giving up for James Harden. But still, whether it was Lowry, whether it was Paul, I really wanted a backcourt upgrade in Philly. And even though they never ended up getting one, of course, they are still very, very good. And like I said, we kind of did our Chris Paul appreciation thing the other day. But it's clear that if you get Chris Paul on your roster and you were already good before, you're going to be great before. You're going to be great afterwards. You know what I mean? And this stuff in Phoenix is like, it cannot be overlooked how much of an impact Chris Paul is having. It's not like the Suns are the 7th seed and they're a nice up and coming story. They are arguably the best regular season team in the league right now. You know what I mean? So it is pretty crazy to imagine that level of impact then ending up in Philly. And again, just the fact that he chose Phoenix over Philly kind of boggles my mind. I'd be interested to find out what other teams potentially were interested in trading for Chris Paul, maybe some other situations that he chose Phoenix over. There were some rumors about him possibly ending up with the Lakers, and I think I made a video about the fact that that was just basically impossible, at the time for them to be able to make that work given the salary stuff with Chris Paul. And we'll kind of see what happens moving forward. This guy's an upcoming free agent. Maybe he doesn't end up staying in Phoenix. Maybe he ends up getting overpaid and it kind of tarnishes his legacy. I'm not sure, but it just would have been really cool to see him in Philly. But at the end of the day, Phoenix is real. Phoenix is legit. And Chris Paul, is going to have a legit All-NBA / maybe even MVP case. Not that he's going to win it, but just a guy that, should probably be in the conversation given how good Phoenix has been. And all that stuff could have been, in Philadelphia in exchange for Al Horford. And I think that's the other interesting part too, is like, it's clear that conversations were had about this, because they did end up making the Danny Green Al Horford trade, and maybe there was a larger structure there, and then they kind of got word that Chris Paul really didn't want to be in Philly. And I find it interesting that Oklahoma City was willing to prioritize that as much as they did, and ultimately maybe the Phoenix package was just better as well. You don't really want the Horford contract if you can help it. They obviously ended up with it, but they got the pick, from Philly in exchange. So I just would have been interested to see what the actual offer was on the table. It seemed like talks were pretty well developed at that point in the offseason, but ultimately he ended up in Phoenix, and I hope all the best for them, and hopefully he gets some postseason success so that people can kind of realize how good this season has been for him and for the Suns. But yeah, that's going to be the end of the first video of the day, and I thank you guys very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, be sure to check out the boxes on screen, leave a like rating on the video, and check me out at various socials, named Linktree link down in the description below. In the second video of the day, we're going to be talking about the Lakers that I briefly mentioned earlier, why you should still be afraid of them despite obviously their recent record, and kind of how they look as we go in to the postseason. With all this things said, hope you guys have an awesome rest of your Saturday, and I will see you all next time.